Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Juvet. I'm with the Business and Industry Association, Senior Vice President here for Public Policy. Thank you for joining us today for the BIA's hosted webinar, Right to Work and the PRO Act, What Every Employer Needs to Know. We're just going to pause for a moment while people begin to join in. Mark Mix, as I mentioned, is president of the National Right to Work Committee. Mark, thank you. I know you're a busy man, so appreciate you taking the time to join us. And let's talk right to work. I should say we had Representative Len Turcott, who is a New Hampshire state rep who's on the Labor Committee, who was planning to be a participant, but got called away by the Speaker of the House at the very last minute. There's a possibility he may be able to join us, but chances are he is going to be taken up with his duties with the Speaker. So Mark, let me turn it to you. And can you tell us, first of all, for those of us who are unfamiliar with what right to work is, can you kind of just explain the concept and also explain a little bit about the number of states that have right to work already passed?
Sure, David. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to Sean and Drew for their explanation of the PRO Act. And to your point, David, it is the single most inclusive labor policy bill that we've dealt with since 1947. There's no question about that. And probably back to the Wagner Act, everything that union officials have asked for to expand their power over workers is in this bill. And in fact, Sean, the one thing, there's other things in there. Sean did a great job of laying out the conditions, but there's also an old provision from a striker replacement provision that basically gives union officials the ability to block replacement workers during an economic strike. And under current law, it's already illegal for an employer to replace workers during an unfair labor practice strike, which is a dispute over a contract. What they want to do now is they want to make sure that when workers walk out over a purely economic issue, like they open their paycheck on a Friday and say, we're not making enough, and they walk off the job. In a Supreme Court case from 1938, the court said, you know what? We recognize the unfair labor practice strike under the Wagner Act, but this economic strike is a totally different matter. I mean, if it passes, then every employer would have to immediately shut down at a strike, because then union officials could call any strike they wanted and win every strike they called because nobody could produce anything. So that's another element of the bill that is part of this monstrosity, not for workers' rights, David. This is the important thing. When you look at the elements of the bill, it's all designed to give union officials more power over workers and more power over employers. And there's not really a whole lot in here, like giving up my personal information about my work shift, my email, my telephone number, my home address. What does that have to do with my rights? What is repealing all the right to work laws, which is a good transition to what we'd like to talk about a little bit here. You know, how does forcing me to pay union dues or fees to a union that I didn't vote for, didn't want, didn't ask for, how is that expanding my rights in the workplace? If you look at each of these provisions of the PRO Act and you pick them out and you analyze them, it's about union power, not about worker rights. And, you know, the fact is that the bill is labeled to promote right to organize or protect the right to organize. Well, we're getting a pretty good example of the right to organize in the Bessemer facility of Amazon right now in Alabama, in the right to work state. Those workers joined together. They're having a vote. The vote closed the other day. They're counting the votes now. I mean, their ability to actually join together, have the vote, and tell their employer that they want a union or don't want a union is something that is part and parcel of the federal law today, and it's protected. So let's not have any illusions about what this is about from a worker standpoint, but everything about what it has for union officials and power over workers and employers. Now, right to work. Obviously, the main target of the PRO Act is the repeal of the 27 right to work laws that are in place right now. In fact, 5 states have passed right to work laws in the last 9 years, starting with Indiana, then Michigan, then Wisconsin, then West Virginia and Kentucky. They have been added to the ranks of the right to work states. And David, real simply, I mean, if you look at the bill that's pending in New Hampshire, Senate Bill 61, if you look at the bills that have been passed and are in the statutes in the 27 states that have them, you'll find that the issue is very simple. The question is, you know, am I compelled to pay fees to a union to keep my job? That's really what it's all about. Right to work doesn't say anything about stopping people from organizing unions. It doesn't say anything about allowing workers to join together voluntarily to amplify their voice by voting a union. It won't stop a worker from giving their entire paycheck to a union if they choose to do so. But what it does do is give worker choice of whether or not they want to be compelled to pay dues or fees to a union to keep their jobs. And we have to give a little bit of history about this to kind of find our way to where we are today. And as Sean and Drew both mentioned, you talk about the Wagner Act, which was Franklin Roosevelt's power grab, basically to use the economic crisis of the 1930s to dramatically expand federal power over the labor, over working men and women in the private sector employment conditions. Basically, we brought it back to Washington and we set up a National Labor Relations Board with 3 members then, 5 members now, to basically adjudicate any dispute in the labor relations field in the private sector. And it was really a major grab. In fact, they tried it in 1937 with the National Industrial, or 1933, excuse me, with the National Industrial Recovery Act, and the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, saying, the states have these powers and the federal government shouldn't grab it. Well, Roosevelt wasn't one to give up. They tried it again with the Wagner Act. He sent a little message over to the Supreme Court saying, hey, you guys are getting old and you might need about 6 more new justices over there, and I'd be glad to appoint them. And I've got the Congress that will do it. So basically, the Supreme Court switched and they ruled the Wagner Act constitutional in 1937. And as Drew said, from 1937 to 1947, the union movement grew dramatically because they had this amazing power to force workers to formally join unions from 1937 to 1947 and all the way up to actually till 1963, till a Supreme Court case called GM, where the Supreme Court said, forcing workers to join a private organization, to formally be a member, is probably a bridge too far, but will force them to pay up to 100% of dues to keep their job. So this labor policy begins with this federal kind of shadow over the entire country. Well, in 1947, I think as Sean mentioned, the union movement grew and there was massive labor disputes across the country. At some point, there was roughly 4 million workers on strike across the country. And the Congress came and said, we need to do something about it. And instead of going back and repealing the Wagner Act, what they do here in Washington is, as Drew said, and both Sean said, we never take anything away. We just try to fix it. And so the Taft-Hartley Act was designed to try to fix it. And it didn't really do a whole lot, but it did do one thing that was obviously very relevant to the topic today, the right to work. Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act was passed. It said, if a state, by affirmative vote or affirmative action, could outlaw the then closed shop, meaning you can't force workers to pay dues or fees to keep their jobs, they could do it. And so from 1947 on, the validity of right to work laws was upheld, and now we have 27. And so Senate Bill 61, that's currently gotten through the Senate, got through Senate committee, got through the Senate floor, got through House committee 2 days ago, I guess it was, on an 11-9 to vote, and now is being ready to be scheduled on the House floor in New Hampshire. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. I know there's some rules and procedures about how things get scheduled on the floor. David, you know a little bit better than that. But we are now at a point where there'll be a vote on making New Hampshire the 28th right to work state in the country. And this is a debate that's going on in New Hampshire for many, many years. It's back in 1985 and 86, the bill was passed by the House and killed by the Senate. We had it passed by the House and the Senate in 2011. Then Governor John Lynch vetoed it. The veto override vote came 13 votes short of 2/3 of the House voting to overturn that vote. And now we have a Senate that has passed it. As I mentioned, we have a House committee that said we want to do pass this and send it to the New Hampshire floor. And so now the House will decide whether or not New Hampshire will become America's 28th right to work state. And again, David, very simply, it simply gives workers the choice. Unions will still, unfortunately, have this monopoly bargaining power where they are the single voice in a unionized workplace. So let me just explain that a little bit, because that's really the foundation of compulsory unionism that was born out of the Wagner Act. This notion that this union is certified and every single employee in the unit, whether they voted yes, no, or didn't vote, they are now in the union for purposes of representation. And the union is the only one that can talk to the employer about terms and conditions of employment. I mean, obviously they negotiate a contract. They say they give the workers a chance to vote on the contract. Most times they do. Sometimes the union can unilaterally impose a contract. We've seen that happen before as well. And so all of these workers who said no are now, they're ineligible to talk to their employer about the terms and conditions of their employment. So everyone's in this collective. And what this collective monopoly power is given the union officials to do is to hinder the best employees in a workplace, protect the worst workers in a workplace, and kind of bring everyone down to the middle. And they say, this is beneficial to everyone. It's not. And that's another problem that we need to get to. But the right to work law won't address that monopoly bargaining power. It simply says, okay, we've taken away your right to speak for yourself. Now we're not going to add insult to injury to make you pay for it. And that's really what the issue is about. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. Notwithstanding the rhetoric, David, that you've heard up there and that will be continue to be heard over the next week for sure. It's a very simple bill and it's worked well. Alabama, as I mentioned, is a right to work state. Those workers down there in Amazon are having that vote. There are some states with right to work laws that have a higher union density than states that don't have right to work laws. The other part about it, from an individual liberty standpoint, is very important. But from an economic development standpoint, it is clear now, even to union officials, that the right to work states are prospering when it comes to private sector job growth, manufacturing job growth, those things that companies are look for when they want to expand and invest in a state. They do ask that question: are you a right to work state? We know the PHS Fairness organization, a corporate consultant, citing consultant, said at least 50% of their clients say we won't even consider a state that doesn't have right to work. So there's an economic development point to it. And Lord knows the Northeast needs that. New Hampshire needs it specifically. Everyone can need new jobs and new opportunities and new ways for people to stay in New Hampshire, raise their families there, and be able to get good paying jobs. And, the final point I'll make, David, and hopefully we'll get some questions about it, is that when you look at wages, union officials all want to say, well, wages in right to work states are less. That's a canard now. If you look at per capita income for workers in right to work states, when you look at their disposable income, when you adjust for cost of living, which is something union officials never want to do, because when they do that, you find out that workers in right to work states, right up until last year, a study that produced by a government agency in Missouri said that workers in right to work states have about $4,600 more to spend in disposable income than workers in forced unions states. So good for individuals, good for the economy, good for New Hampshire.
Thanks, Mark. As a lobbyist here in New Hampshire who's been working hard on this issue at the state level, it's extraordinary to me the amount of misinformation or just, red herrings that are thrown out by the opposition to this bill. And one of them is that I'd like you to speak to is we don't need this bill because under current law now, no one can be forced to join a union. And they never mention about the agency fees or the money that employees are required to contribute for what they call a cost of representation. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, David, that's an interesting argument. And topically, it has an appeal when you think about it. Everyone says, yeah, well, they should pay part of it. But just to remind you that, from 35 to 63, you could be forced to join a union. Unions say now, well, we don't force anyone to join. Well, that's because the GM Supreme Court case said they couldn't. They could charge them up to 100% of dues to keep their jobs. They just couldn't make them be formal members. And one of the problems with that and the way it manifests itself is a Hobson's choice that workers have to make in order to exercise their rights under right to work laws. First of all, in order to exercise your right to pay less than union dues in a forced union state, to pay the so-called agency fee that you call it, or in a right to work state to exercise your rights to pay nothing, you have to give up your union membership. And once you do that, you can't vote in union elections. You can't vote on the contract. You can't participate in any of the conversations about what's happening on the shop floor because you're not a member of the union. So basically, in order to protect your political, ideological rights, you must give up your workplace rights. And Justice Alito addressed this issue squarely in the Supreme Court case that we won back in June of 2018 called Janus. What we got there was we got the question of whether or not the forced payment of fees of all government employees across the United States was a violation of their free speech, their First Amendment. And Alito got to that and he said, you know what? Everything that government unions do, and I know this is different in the private sector, so let me expand on this just a little bit. He said everything that government unions do is political, and therefore it's speech, and therefore it can't be compelled. And so we now have right to work laws for every government employee in America, including New Hampshire. Not one firefighter, not one teacher. Anyone in New Hampshire right now who's in the public sector employed by a government entity can choose not to pay dues or fees and still keep their jobs. That's a big victory. But in the private sector, what's happened is, the union can force them to pay fees, but they still have this right where they have to give up their political and ideological rights. Imagine this. If you're an operating engineer that was working on the Keystone Pipeline and you're a proud union member, your union dues have gone to your union officials here in Washington endorsed Joe Biden for the presidency. And he said back in May of 2020 that if he was elected, he would immediately withdraw the permit to continue construction on the Keystone Pipeline. So all of these pipe fitters and these welders and these operating engineers and the LIUNA members that were working on that project labor agreement, which means only union workers were on it, have now been put on the unemployment line. Would you want to still pay union dues to a union that helped a president that put you on the unemployment line? That's the accountability that right to work brings to the union movement. Donald Richburg, who was the author of the Railway Labor Act in 1926, he was one of FDR's kitchen cabinet members. He helped him draft the National Industrial Recovery Act, and he had drafted the Railway Labor Act, where kind of compulsory union was kind of baked into the federal cake. And he recognized in the 1950s, he said, the only way rank and file workers can hold their union officials accountable is to hold them accountable by their wallet. the ability to withhold their money and stop the union from playing politics and focus on the shop floor. That's what right to work tends to do. It tends to create accountability for rank and file workers to say, you know what, we don't like what you're doing because you're playing politics way too much, and we're not going to pay for that. And we think they should have the right to do that, to protect their right and their labor, to give it where they want it and when they want it.
Yeah, you know, Mark, all along in the legislative process, one of the things that we have always mentioned in our testimony is nobody is forced to join the BIA or the National Association of Manufacturers or the U.S. Chamber or any other
Or the Right to Work Committee.
Representing business. Yet the work we do benefits all business.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be great if there was some way we could force businesses to join the BIA too? I say that in jest, of course.
No, it's a good business model,
but it
David.
does illustrate the difference between what exists with labor organizations now and with other private sector entities like trade associations.
Yeah.
I want to quickly